He had it all: titles, glory, and the respect of the world. But when war called his name, he said no. And in a single instant, the champion became the most hated man in America. It was the height of the 1960s. The United States was immersed in a distant, brutal, and bloody war, Vietnam. Thousands of young men were being drafted, sent against their will, to fight in an unknown jungle against a seemingly invisible enemy. Amidst this landscape, one name shone above all others: Muhammad Ali, the man who conquered the world with his fists, his speed, his sharp mouth, and his unshakable confidence. But the most dangerous fight of his life wouldn't be inside a ring, it would be against the system itself. When the government called him to don the uniform, Ali firmly replied, "No Viet Cong ever called me nigger." The phrase exploded like a bomb. In American society, divided between patriotism and the fight for civil rights, for many it was treason, for others, courage. But the truth is that at that moment, Ali wasn't just a boxer, he was the voice of millions who never had a voice. And the consequences would come swiftly, like a punch in the gut. Titles stripped, licenses revoked, doors closed. The man who was called the greatest came to be called a coward, a deserter, an enemy of the country. He would lose not only his career but also his freedom. The world that had applauded him began to stone him, and he would have to face something far greater than any opponent in the ring: the judgment of society, political persecution, and imprisonment. This is the story of the fight outside the ring, of the day Muhammad Ali risked everything: fame, money, and glory to defend what he believed in. A battle that would transform the boxer into an eternal symbol of resistance. Straight to the point, April 28, 1967, Muhammad Ali, already world heavyweight champion, enters a military office in Houston. The atmosphere is tense. Officials are just waiting for a signature, but the silence is broken by a firm refusal. He refuses to step forward. He refuses to enlist. The room freezes. Looks are filled with shock and anger. In a matter of seconds, what should have been a simple formality becomes a global headline. The refusal was not just a political gesture, it was a direct challenge to a country steeped in racial hatred. Ali, a black man, a converted Muslim, a symbol of the new, rebellious youth, dared to say no to the government. He didn't run away, he didn't hide. He clearly stated that he would not fight against a people who had never harmed him, while his own people, in his own country, were still lynched, discriminated against, and segregated. It was a blow to the conscience of a nation. Ali knew the weight of the decision. Friends tried to convince him to give in, at least silently, just to save his career, but he wouldn't back down. When journalists crowded around him, his response was short and direct: "Why would you ask me to put on a uniform and travel 10,000 miles to shoot poor people? They never called me nigger. My enemy is here." At that moment, Ali wasn't just a boxer. He became a symbol of resistance against a senseless war, against a system that treated black people as second-class citizens. But this gesture would come at a high price. He was about to lose everything. And so began the toughest fight of his life, a fight without gloves, without referees, without set rounds. Immediately after his refusal in Houston, the blow was immediate. Muhammad Ali was sentenced to 5 years in prison and fined $10,000, a fortune for any common man. Although he was on parole while appealing, the sentence was clear. He was considered a federal criminal. More than that, the Athletic Commission immediately suspended him, revoking his license to fight, and, as if that weren't enough, all boxing organizations banned him, taking away his belts. In a single afternoon, the undefeated champion, holder of the world heavyweight title, saw everything ripped away from him. The headlines were harsh. Ali, the deserter. Radio shows called him a coward. Newspapers demanded his immediate arrest. Former fans spat out his name. Invitations from sponsors evaporated. The man who once paraded in convertibles, cheered by crowds, now walked under boos, insults, and death threats. It was as if he had been wiped off the map. And yet, even under this weight, he did not back down. In interviews, his voice never wavered. He would say, "I'd rather lose millions. I'd rather lose my career than lose my soul." This phrase resonated beyond boxing. While millions of young men were forcibly drafted into Vietnam, many without choice, without power, Ali symbolized what they longed to say, but it came at a brutal personal cost. Without money, without a ring, he began giving lectures at universities, speaking out against the war and advocating for civil rights. From a millionaire star, he transformed into an itinerant preacher, surviving on speeches, facing audiences divided between applause and insults. But there was one thing no one could erase: his courage. At his physical peak between the ages of 25 and 29, when he could have had the greatest fights of his career, Ollie was banned from fighting. It was almost 4 years out of the ring, the most valuable years, the years in which a boxer reaches perfection. For any other athlete, this would have meant the end. For Ollie, it meant a new beginning. He didn't keep quiet. At a press conference, when asked if he regretted losing everything, he replied, "If I had agreed to fight, I would have sold my faith. I would have betrayed my people. I prefer to be remembered as a man who stood tall." Words that sounded like a battle cry to some, and like venom to others. But they were, above all, sincere. Ollie was no longer just the champion of the ring. He was the man who dared to face his own nation. The price was the silence of fists, the shadow of prison, and the contempt of millions. But in that silence he became even greater, and it's at this point that the story takes a turn, because, amidst all this persecution, something began to change. Little by little, the villain began to become a hero. The man who had lost everything began to transform into a symbol of resistance. And if you've been following along this far, this is the perfect time to support the channel. Like, subscribe, and comment on what you think about Ollie's decision. This helps us bring you more intense stories like this one and, of course, keeps the flame of unforgettable narratives alive. But the journey doesn't stop there. Because from his exile from boxing, a new Muhammad Ali would emerge, not just the fighter, but the icon who would forever change the history of sports and politics. When Muhammad Ali was banned from boxing, many believed his career, his image, and even his life were over. But it was precisely during this dark period that he began to transform into something much greater than a ring champion. Once removed from the sporting spotlight, Ollie became a voice echoing in the streets, on campuses, and in anti-war protests. He ceased to be merely a sports idol and became seen as a symbol of resistance, especially for young people in the black community who lived daily with the realities of segregation, poverty, and police violence. Ollie's speeches inflamed audiences. He would say, "You call me a coward because I don't want to fight in Vietnam. But who's the bigger coward? I, who say no, or those who send poor boys to die in an unjust war?" These words hit like fists. Many students gave him a standing ovation, but at the same time, conservative groups hated him even more. It was impossible to remain indifferent to him. Every speech made headlines, every sentence turned into gunpowder. Meanwhile, civil rights movements were gaining momentum. Martin Luther King Jr. had already spoken out against the war, and when Ali was convicted, black leaders saw him as a warrior outside the ring. King even said that Ali's courage inspired an entire generation to confront an unjust system. Little by little, the man who had been called a traitor began to be seen as a martyr. The villain constructed by the conservative media became a hero to those fighting for justice, but the transformation wasn't immediate. It took years of resistance, financial loss, and harsh criticism. Ollie saw friends drift away, doors close, and his own family suffer threats. And yet, he wouldn't back down. He knew silence would be more comfortable, but also more cowardly, and his determination, paradoxically, began to inspire even those who had previously condemned him. He gradually became a universal symbol of courage. Most strikingly, his absence from the ring made him even more legendary. The image of the silenced champion grew into a myth. The audience, which had previously booed him, began to wonder, what if he returns? Will he still have the strength? Will he still be able to face the new giants of boxing? This anticipation, this tension set the stage for something epic. Ali, without fighting a single round, was already winning the greatest battle of all, the battle for collective consciousness. He proved that his voice was as powerful as his fists, and when society began to see the war as a historic mistake, Ollie ceased to be the deserter and became the man who had the courage to say no before everyone else. Time was beginning to turn in his favor, and what seemed like the end was just preparation for the greatest comeback in sports history. 4 years away from the ring seemed like an endless sentence, but the silence broke in 1970. In Atlanta, the lights came on as if the city itself was breathing around him. Ollie walked to the sound of boos and applause, a man who had traded crowns for conviction, and was now reclaiming what made him dangerous: time. On the other side, Jerry Quarry, tough, proud, ready to test the scars of exile. Ollie's first jab wasn't just a blow, it was an announcement, light-legged, loose-fitting, head held high. He reshaped the air around him, reminding the world that talent doesn't expire. The cut on Quarry opened the door to rebirth, and the fight ended early. But the message remained. The untitled champion was alive. Days later, against Bonavina, he proved his stamina and patience. taking down the giant in the end and demanding more. It wasn't just technique, it was resistance turned into art. Every step, an argument, every dodge, a manifesto. He had lost years, not his purpose. And, by raising his arms, he celebrated the right to exist fully. The world wanted the ultimate test, and it came like thunder. Ali versus Frazier, the undefeated man of raw power versus the poet hungry for lost time. Madison Square Garden became a cauldron. Bell stepped forward, eye to eye. Joe advanced heavily, hooks to the body, hammering ribs as if paying the bill for the years. Ali responded with arrow-like jabs, danced when he could, but the absence took its toll. Every clinch was a memory of Atlanta, every blow, a reminder of Houston. In the 15th, Frazier's left hook felled him like a felled tree, and the crowd held its breath. He got up. He stayed until the end. He lost, and in that harsh silence after the judges, there was no excuse, only truth. His body was no longer the same, but the flame still burned. When he left the arena tired, he shook hands with those who booed him and promised to return. The defeat didn't shatter his name, it burnished the legend. Fight of the century, they called it. He gained momentum without winning. He understood. Returning is not a shortcut. It is a road of pain and stubbornness. In 1971, the Supreme Court overturned his conviction, and the criminal label fell to the ground like an old glove. Ali returned to crisscrossing states, closing purses, signing contracts, and putting his body back in the oven. There was no magic. There was training, pain, repetition. Heavyweights arrived, and with them the price of truth. Ken Norton broke his jaw and took the victory, making it clear that the road would be cruel. Ali returned and defeated Norton in the final bout, measuring distance with jabs that sounded like a metronome. Then he met Frazier again. The hatred between them was part of the box office, but the fight was more than a feud. It was a settling of accounts with his own past. Ali used sidesteps, locked in clinches, set the pace, and, when the final bell sounded, he had the edge and stamina. Revenge was achieved, not through humiliation, but through precision and consistency. What he was rebuilding wasn't just a cartel, it was authority over himself. The biggest mountain remained, George Foreman, devastating champion, and the stage would be Kinshasa, in the heart of Africa, and Kinshasa vibrated like a drum. Crowds surrounded the hotel chanting Ali May as if every syllable were a talisman. Foreman trained like a storm, punches pierced sandbags, and rumor had it he carried the strength of two men. Ali walked lightly, smiled, chatted with children, but at night he studied shadows. He knew he couldn't trade brute force. He needed to trade time. He devised a trap, lean against the ropes, let the giant waste ammunition reel in the blows, protect his ribs, listen to the others breathing slow. Between clinch and clinch, he whispered provocations, as if stealing air from his enemy. They would call it rope-a-dope. On the appointed day, the city seemed to boil inside. There was dust in the air, sweat on their skin, cameras everywhere. When the two faced each other, they weren't just athletes. They were ideas, in conflict. Ali lifted his chin. Foreman clenched his fists. The gong about to ring held a simple secret. Courage is patience on fire. That's it, Kinshasa. Early morning of October 30th, 1974, the packed arena seemed to breathe in unison. The whole world was watching. Ali, at 32, was no longer the same insolent boy who defied the government. He was a man marked by exile, defeats, and the pressure to prove he was still the greatest. On the other side stood George Foreman, the undefeated champion, younger, stronger, and the most feared puncher of the time. Many believed Ali would be destroyed in a few rounds, but he had another plan, and when the bell rang, the greatest fight of all began. Foreman advanced furiously. His blows slammed like sledgehammers reverberating through Ali's body, but instead of dancing around the ring as before, he pressed himself against the ropes. Ali cowered, letting Foreman strike, blocking, absorbing, provoking. He whispered in his rival's ear, "Is that it? Hit harder." The crowd, confused, didn't understand. It seemed like suicide, but it made sense. It was the rope-a-dope trap. Every punch Foreman threw was wasted energy, stolen air, youth turning to exhaustion. The rounds dragged on. Sweat poured down like rain. Foreman was beginning to tire, his arm heavy, his gaze dull. Ali, on the other hand, seemed to be reborn with every passing minute. And then, in the 8th round, it happened. A clean, precise right hand exploded in Foreman's face. The giant collapsed to the ground like a wall being torn down. The count echoed, 7, 8, and when it reached 10, the impossible was done. Muhammad Ali was world champion again, but that victory was much more than a title. It was the culmination of his journey. The man who refused war, who was imprisoned, who lost his belts, and was called a coward, was now celebrated as a global hero, not only for defeating Foreman, but for proving that resistance, even against all odds, could be rewarded. He became a symbol of courage, faith, and dignity. The man who faced the most powerful government in the world and paid the price now stood tall, glorified before millions. Ali didn't just defeat Foreman, he defeated time, politics, and injustice. He won the war without fighting it. His struggle outside the ring was reflected in every punch he threw, and when he raised his arms at African dawn, he carried not just a belt, but the weight of a generation that found in him voice, resilience, and inspiration. And that's why his story doesn't end in Kinshasa, because Muhammad Ali left a legacy that goes beyond sport. He showed that being a champion isn't just about defeating opponents, but fighting for what you believe, even if the price is your own freedom. Don't in the end. His life teaches us a simple but powerful lesson. Titles can be taken, money can be lost, but courage can't be taken away. And it was this courage that made Ali not only the greatest boxer of all time, but an eternal symbol of resilience. Muhammad Ali's life proves that there are fights far greater than any championship. He could have chosen the easy path, don the uniform, follow protocol, and maintain his fortune, fame, and applause. But he decided to say no, and that no cost years of silence, persecution, and humiliation. It cost him the loss of titles, money, and recognition. However, by refusing to fight in a war that wasn't his, Ali became something far beyond a boxer. He became the voice of millions who had never been heard, courage embodied in flesh and blood. What few understood at the time is that Ali wasn't just defending his faith or his community. He was defending the idea that human dignity is worth more than any belt. And it was precisely this conviction that kept him going when all seemed lost. In the end, when he regained his titles and was once again cheered, his victory wasn't just sporting. It was moral, political, and historic. Looking back today, we realize that Ali's greatness isn't measured solely by knockouts or legendary fights. It's measured by his ability to face invisible giants, prejudice, injustice, war. Ali proved that you don't need to wear a uniform to be a soldier. Sometimes the greatest battle is the one fought within yourself, and the greatest victory is remaining true to your convictions. Even if the whole world tries to tear you down, therefore, his story isn't just about boxing, it's about courage. It's about never giving up, even when everything conspires against you. It's about remembering that the real fight doesn't happen in the ring, but in life. Muhammad Ali wasn't just the greatest boxer in history, he was, and always will be, the greatest symbol of resistance of our time.